The Institute is a bridge between the university and the community. It's also at the core of the mission of NYU Abu Dhabi. So we started building bridges with the community because the lectures we put on were essentially for the community. And our aim was, of course, it always has been to reach out to Emiratis in the public and private sectors, to make Emiratis part of the conversation we were establishing.
We invite up to 800 people, 800 international scholars every single year to gather in up to 30 conferences and workshops. So one can say that part of our mission, and this relates directly to the mission of the university, is to bring international scholarship, international culture to the region. And the UAE is a great country in facilitating us to do that.
We stress is the fact that this is a research-based institution, so that the people we invite to speak are scholars, researchers, experts in their field. They're people who are pushing the envelope in their field. So whatever they speak about, they're providing insights to people, advanced level research, and made accessible to the public.
So the Institute has several goals. An important one is outreach to a general public, which is generally addressed by this fantastic evening program that we run. Lectures about an hour, and then you have a Q&A, and people get very involved in what we as a community have to offer in terms of scholarship that is of interest to a wider public.
I'm confident that the Institute will continue to put on events on a par with the events we've put on in the past. The quality of the events will sustain that. And why am I confident? Because this is the whole, this region, this place in particular, Abu Dhabi, is growing, developing. There's so much more for us to draw on. More students, more faculty, a growing community, and obviously issues that won't go away, that touch us all. These things don't go away, so there's more and more for us to talk about. We really can promise, a growing phase in the next 10 years.
Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone. I would like to first begin our conversation tonight by extending a welcome to His Excellency Dr. Ali bin Tamim, Chairman of the Arabic Language Center and Secretary General of the Sheikh Zayed Book Award. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would also like to introduce Moza Shamsi, Acting Executive Director of the Abu Dhabi Arabic Language Center and Director of the Sheikh Zayed Book Award, who would like to speak to us for a few minutes.
Hello, everybody. We are delighted with the ongoing and fruitful cooperation between Sheikh Zayed Book Award and NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, and the substantial role it plays in deepening cultural understanding. Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, continues to be a major source of intellectual and literary cultivation for everyone around the world, enriching Arabic and global culture with an everlasting touch of inspiration. This is a stellar work that is open to research and analysis, actually, and that is what our distinguished guests are about to do in today's seminar. Thank you for joining us, and many thanks for His Excellency Dr. Ali bin Tamim, Chairman of Arabic Language Center and Secretary General of the Sheikh Zayed Book Award, for his leadership, counsel, and guidance. We shall now start. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Moza. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing the two speakers tonight who are going to be in conversation about the legacies and afterlives of the 1001 Nights. First, Professor Richard van Leeuwen is a senior lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Amsterdam. He's published widely on the history of the Middle East, Arabic literature, and Islam, and is also a translator of Arabic literature. He received the Sheikh Zayed Book Award for Arab culture and other languages in 2020 for his book, which we will be talking about this evening, and I'm very excited about that, The 1001 Nights in 20th Century Fiction, Intertextual Readings, published by Brill Publishers in 2018. Our second speaker is Professor Philip Kennedy, who's an academic and researcher specializing in Middle Eastern Islamic studies. Hi, Philip. He holds a PhD in classical Arabic poetry, and he is the Vice Provost for Public Programming at the NYUAD Institute and the General Editor of the Library of Arabic Literature. He also received the Sheikh Zayed Book Award for Arab Culture and Other Languages in 2019 for his book Recognition in the Arabic Narrative Tradition, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2016. So welcome everyone. And I want to start by talking a little bit about what is so special about the 1001 Nights for my two speakers. I know for me it's fascinating because it's a text that technically has no one author and no one origin, and what's amazing about it, what keeps bringing me back to it, is the figure of Shahrazad herself, who is the storyteller, right? The identifier of the night. So I wanted to start by asking both of you, what is your favorite tale? What is your favorite interaction with the 1001 Nights? Richard, would you like to start? You're muted.
Mute. Sorry. Thank you for your introduction. Of course, asking about the most favorite tale of the 1001 Nights is one of the most difficult questions to answer about the 1001 Nights, because the collection is so enormous and it's so enormously diverse. Of course, there are stories that are more accomplished than others. Some stories are even quite tedious, whereas others are entertaining. But on the whole, I should say that there's a story for every mood and for every taste. And even if stories are not very successful in the objective sense, then usually they are quite curious and strange. So they're always interesting somehow, in one respect or another. And of course, I translated the 1001 Nights into Dutch. So the correct answer for me would be to say that all the stories are equally important and interesting to me. But on the other hand, I should say that there's one story that I particularly like very much because it epitomizes the complexity of the 1001 Nights and the complex backgrounds and origin and trajectory of the 1001 Nights. And that's the story of the Queen of the Serpents, which is a very large, long story. It contains references to very ancient material, to magic, to love. It has embedded stories as well. So it's a kind of story representing the tradition of the 1001 Nights as a whole, the complexity and the different themes that are treated in the various stories of the material.
Thank you. Philip? You're still on mute.
We're good at this. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I thought your answer was great, hard to follow. So I'm not a translator of the 1001 Nights in part or even in their fullness. But, I do want to start by thanking Dr. Ali and Tamim for being in attendance. I can only say that I believe he's in attendance because I can't see him. But that seems to be a kind of Borgesian situation that we're in. So I do mean it from the bottom of my heart, you know. It's great that you're there, Dr. Ali. I'm thinking of you, and thank you for being behind this joint venture, the Institute and Sheikh Zayed Award. As to the question, you know, I think Richard made some very obvious
points, but essential points. The vastness of the corpus makes it almost impossible to say what is your favorite story. It's, it's like the syndrome of, I was thinking of the syndrome of coming out of the cinema and someone asks you, did you like the film? What's your favorite film? I say, well, the one I just seen. It's just the one I just seen. The one I just seen, why? Because I can remember it, There's so much to remember. And, of course, our brains don't capture all. But in part, my answer would be the tale of Zumurrud and Ali Kishar, because the way that Pier Pasolini made that story his, but of course respected it in its original spirit, and because of the way the actors portray, such likable characters. Some of them are, of course, dastardly characters, but the likable ones are very likable, and I like the story because of it and because of the way he's made a collage of Arabian Nights stories within the frame of the Zumurrud Ali Shah tale, but respecting while doing that the structure of the whole story as a romance. So I love that story. But I do like the Two Viziers, because I think it's a perfect study in comic romance. It's almost, and it tells one a lot about the poetics of these stories, of the people who, whoever they were, these mysterious redactors, knew what they were doing in terms of the poetics of narrative. It's like, this is a real study in poetics of a certain kind of narrative construction. I love that story, and I like to link it with the story of the Barmer kids. But of course, I asked about the Barmer kids off stage or later, because they're not in the Nights, surprisingly. It's one of the big surprises for me, except insofar as Jafar al-Barmaki is always there accompanying Harun al-Rashid and Masroor, the big irony being that they're bosom pals in the Nights, but of course we know that Harun al-Rashid had Jafar al-Barmaki butchered on one night in 803 of the Common Era. But I'd say my favorite story, but I sort of, why am I reticent in saying this is because it's so hard to talk about, is the Poor and the Three Ladies of Baghdad. The complexity of that ensemble is, to me, unmatched in all of world literature. There's a collage, but a collage of stories that mean that means something as a whole. In their aggregate, they mean something, and the aggregate accumulates. I love the mystery of it. This mysterious house. There's nothing like it. These three women who are the household owners of this mysterious house, where mysterious things happen. Of course, nothing more mysterious than three people turning up one day at the same time. They didn't know each other, but with one eye and shaved in the same way, a very odd way, I must add. And they show up at the same time as Harun al-Rashid, Masroor, and Jafar al-Barmaki, and lo and behold, who I've just mentioned. And then things happen that are just crazy. Of course, it brings out a lot of human themes, and one of them is, of course, the curiosity that we humans have, and the curiosity of hearing a story. When we see something odd, we want to hear a story. And this ensemble makes such a good aggregate of the curiosity of wanting to hear stories. Mm-hmm. But I also like, and I'm going to say this because it's odd, you only wanted one, I know, but in this discussion of Coleridge, I don't know where I read this, whether it's Robert Owen or someone else who's analysed Coleridge. He says the Ancient Mariner. I mean, Coleridge loved the 1001 Nights from when he was a young boy, and he was actually, when his father found, he would wait in the library of his house, waiting for the sun to shine upon the library shelves where the 1001 Nights were arranged. And when his father found out that he was obsessed by these books, he took them away because they were having a bad influence on Coleridge. Don't know what that was, but anyway. But Coleridge, yes, he loved the Nights among many others of his generation. I think it's always easier to find the exceptions than those who did like the Nights. But Coleridge's Ancient Mariner is, yeah, one person, one scholar, I thought, said something very insightful about the Ancient Mariner, and the fact it might have been inspired by the first set of tales that Sherazade begins to tell, which is the tale of the merchant and the genie. And it's the story of the merchant who's peeling a date, and he throws the date pit away and kills a genie's son in doing that. And it's the fate that falls upon him that he cannot avoid, that is evoked for this scholar in Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. Once you've done something, the fates that chase you then will never stop chasing you until things take their course. So I like that.
Absolutely. I mean, you actually, well, first I want to say that Dr. Ali bin Tamim is with us and is hearing you. So I thought, yes, you would like to hear that. And then you led us, Philip, to my next question, actually, to both you and Richard, which is Richard's fantastic book is all about the multiple and many returns of the 1001 Nights. And I was wondering, in connection to this conversation on Coleridge, maybe you can tell us, Richard, your favorite or one of your favorite returns. Your book is very rich and goes through so many wonderful examples, and I'll come back to several of them, but maybe you can tell us about one of your favorite moments of adaptation and return in modern or contemporary literature of the 1001 Nights.
Well, I thought the previous question was difficult, but this is even more difficult. But of course, the whole work on this book and the research has been kind of journey of discovery. I mean, it provided an opportunity to read and to explore Western literature and Arabic literature in quite a new way, being guided by the phenomenon of the 1001 Nights, which opens up an enormous universe of literature. Not only literature, because the book is the whole trajectory of the 1001 Nights is connected with history, with cultural history, with politics, cultural exchange, etc. So it's not only literary influence which is relevant for this kind of research. And I started reading about the influences of the 1001 Nights in the 18th century, which is, of course, the period in which, well, Western literature, modern Western literature was invented, was being developed for the first time. And it is no coincidence, I think, that the 1001 Nights was translated in the beginning of the 18th century, and immediately had an enormous response among literati in Europe, especially in France and England and Germany. And this is, I think, the period in which the 1001 Nights translated, the French translation of the 1001 Nights, because this is very important, that if we talk about the 1001 Nights and its reception and influence in Western literature, we talk about translations, because usually authors could not read Arabic, so they had to rely on the versions that were available to them. So this means that the tradition of literary influence is intimately related to the tradition of translations. But there was an enormous response from writers from various kinds who read 1001 Nights and were immediately enthusiastic, and who used the material of the 1001 Nights and the concept of the 1001 Nights to experiment with new literary forms. And this is the way in which the Thousand and One Nights became part of the Western literary tradition. So from the beginning, actually, it was, I should say, not so much received, but incorporated into the Western literary field in the phase in which Western literature was developing. And this continued. I mean, Thousand and One Nights became part of, you might say, the DNA of Western literature and Western culture. And it stayed that way during the 19th century and during the 20th century. And this is actually one of the things that I would like to show in my book, that although the influence of the Thousand and One Nights has been acknowledged to a certain extent, it has not been accepted yet, recognized yet, that it has had such a structural influence on the development of Western and European literature. And not only in the 18th century, but actually in all the different phases of its development, and especially in phases in which authors experimented with new forms and new genres and new types of literature. And both in the 19th century, the different kind of development of the European novel, but also in the modernist and postmodernist periods in which new forms were sought. So if you look at this enormous trajectory and the many authors and works that have been influenced by the Thousand and One Nights and that have cooperated in, contributed to integrating the Thousand and One Nights into Western literature. So, and you can see that it's really in a vast amount of works. If I restrict myself to the 20th century and to the authors that I studied for this book, there are several you might say, fields which were really discoveries for me. One is, for instance, the importance of the Thousand and One Nights in the development of modern Argentinian literature. Mm-hmm. So it's not only Borges, it's widely known that Borges was interested in and influenced by the Thousand and One Nights. But authors before him and after him also refer to the Thousand and One Nights. And you can say that in modern Argentinian literature, the Thousand and One Nights became a kind of a trope, which was structurally linked in the development of Argentinian literature. Another example is the interest in the figure of Aladdin in Scandinavian literature, which I didn't know before, which is amazing because it is because of the 19th century play, which is called Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, written by Eulenschläger, who is more or less the founder of modern Danish literature. And he used Aladdin as a kind of trope, a kind of character which represented Danish Scandinavian culture in the modern era. And so intellectuals and writers took up this example and elaborated on this. So he became a kind of icon within Scandinavian literature, representing the different aspects of modernity in the Scandinavian countries. So he returns, the figure of Aladdin returns in many different forms, in novels and plays and music even, and painting in Scandinavia as a symbol of Scandinavian modernism. And then I was really amazed by the way in which the Thousand and One Nights was served as a kind of intertextual reference for authors in Germany in the interwar periods, which is really amazing. These are usually authors who were well, we would say right-wing conservatives, and you would not not expect really that they would be interested in this kind of material. But in fact, the work of, for instance, Ernst Jünger was greatly inspired by several tropes from the 1001 Nights. So this was really a discovery, and the discovery is, of course, the many different ways in which the material of the 1001 Nights was used by these different authors, and how they, because the authors are so different and their interests are so different, but they could always refer to the 1001 Nights and find examples and find inspiration, and this is well, really amazing, actually, if you find out these influences. But if you like to have an answer, a concise answer, which is perhaps too difficult, but there is actually one author which I really admired and which I had read before, but really rediscovered, and because I reread his works and I found a lot of new views on his work, and that's Vladimir Nabokov, or Nabokov, I don't know how you pronounce it, but I was really astonished by the richness of his work and the way he refers to the 1001 Nights in a very complex way. Of course, his work is very complex, and you can read it in a very straightforward way, but it contains so many different levels. And to see how he weaves the 1001 Nights in these levels in different works is really amazing. So on the one hand, the question is too big to answer, but on the other hand, there are, of course, favorite authors and favorite cases.
Thank you so much for that very rich answer and the rich book that you've given us. And I really, really especially like how you talk about translation of the Nights from the beginning as being an act of appropriation, that from the get-go became constitutive of European narrative and narrative experiments, which really challenges a dominant view or Orientalist approach to reading the Nights, or the interaction between Europe and the Nights, right? And this is one of the things I found really fascinating about many of your conclusions, was how you look at how the Nights are recycled and used, one, to explode narrative forms and create new ones, but also to reflect on one's own culture, and what's broken and what's working and what's not. So I thought that was fascinating. And the way you made the link now just makes me think of how the many adaptations of the 1001 Nights are in fact a beautiful metaphor for world literature, if we were to take it very seriously, as how texts actually travel and become parts of other places in real ways, in really contextualized ways. I wanted to go to you now, Philip, and see if you would like to comment on your favorite or one of the most poignant forms of adaptation of the Nights in modern literature for you. You're muted still. Philip, you're on mute. Sorry.
There we are. Learning. Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry to be a bit of a mutant with this Zoom thing. I like Richard's answer, and I can only sort of genuflect at the helm of Richard's scholarly gown, really, and begin by talking about his book, which I think is an amazing book. I think if anyone reads the chapter called Children of the Nights in Owen's famous book, The Arabian Nights Companion, will probably recognize most of the authors that Robert there talks about as having had an influence, having been influenced by the Nights. But what you read we're in a different place with Richard's book. And it struck me because I haven't, it's a book that takes a long time to digest intellectually, and so it's a book I carry on reading. I was struck by so many things, but one thing that struck me on a sort of macro level was that this book is really a kind of, it seems to me, a kind of writing out of the poetics of narrative for the 21st century, that may or may not have been influenced by the Nights, but may well have been influenced by the Nights. Not all, I don't know if Richard would agree, not all the texts that he deals with are necessarily texts where the author was consciously doing something with the Arabian Nights. But on some level, yes, there is, and if you take the book as a whole, then there's something that Richard has done, which to really to talk about the essential poetics of narrative. And because the 1001 Nights is such an important collection of texts for how narrative works, I think he's done a fantastic thing in allowing us to see further, I would say, to see further. And some of the choices, of course, I like Borges a lot as Return. Of course, the theme of Return is so relevant to the night because of the theme of, because of the preponderance of romances, and a romance, of course, always ends with a return. And Two Viziers, one of my favorites, ends with return and the recreation of identity, or the reappropriation of one's own identity, not someone else's. What I was very struck by, I'll say two more things then. I really like Dominic Cook's adaptation of the Arabian Nights for the stage. He brought it to New York in 1999, and it was for a young audience, but also a mature audience. And he did really what Pasolini did, but the style is completely different. He constructed a whole out of bricolage, taking bits and pieces from the Arabian Nights. Not many of which are in Mahdi's so-called pure core of the Nights. I like what he did, Dominic Cook. I think it works very well, and I can talk about the poetics of that if you like, but I won't. I've written about it. I want to turn to something that was completely astounding to me. I almost fell off my chair when I started reading Absalom in Richard's book, because that is a book, it's one of my favorite books. I've read it twice. Yeah, William Faulkner's Absalom. I never thought of the Arabian Nights when I was reading that. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary book, a very visceral book, and of course telling stories is so much a part of it, that I'm still struck by that, and I feel I'm only sort of a quarter way there to understanding how Richard means what he is telling us. But because of the newness of what Richard is telling us, that perhaps is something I would mark around as something of vital interest to me now. Mm. As someone who studies literature. Maybe we can talk about it in a minute, but that's all I'll say.
Well, to me too, actually, it's particularly this notion of what constitutes influence, right? And this is one of the amazing things about the book, Richard, is in many cases, some cases the influence is very obvious, and in other cases the influence is not so obvious. But you can tell the story anyway, and you can create those potential stories and potential links between this afterlife and the potential origin in the 1001 Nights. And I was wondering if you could both speak to that a little bit more as to how do you think, as scholars who look at the afterlives of texts and translation, how do you think of influence? Is influence something that is just formal or thematic or a combination of both? Is it something that we can trace in an archive or something that we can, as readers, get a feel for? As a literature scholar myself, I've always been fascinated with this notion of influence, and I'm wondering if you can just speak to how you approach influence, or what influence means to you in your scholarship.
Yeah. Well, Richard, you want to go ahead?
Well, yes, I was struck by you using the word appropriation for the, how do you say, I would say the incorporation of the 1001 Nights into the Western tradition, or the tradition of world literature. Because actually appropriation is not a very neutral word. It has a kind of connotation within the model of Orientalism as it has been conceived by Edward Said, because it says that the West has appropriated Arabic, Islamic culture, distorted it, changed it to its own taste, etc., and made something new out of it, which is different from the authentic model, you might say. So this is certainly not a neutral term. It's connected with all kinds of ideological connotations. So this is actually what I was trying to avoid. I have to say that because this is a discussion which refers to the political side, ideological side of cultural exchange, and this is of course very important. But I think the discussion has been dominated too much by these ideological views, and as that the literary textual mechanisms and aspects have been lost in the discussion. And what I would like to stress in my book is that the whole process of cultural and literary exchange has its own mechanisms and its own factors and dynamics. And so this is not only ideologically driven or politically driven, but also aesthetically driven. And I think this is a very important aspect. I would say that a transmission of texts across cultural borders, cultural boundaries, would always involve a kind of appropriation, a kind of distortion, etc. So this is a natural thing. This is inherent in the process of transmission, and you cannot avoid it. And in fact, it is more or less required for a literary work to be to make the transition from one literary field to another, to be to some extent adapted and accommodated to a new taste, to the new structure of a literary field in which it has to evolve, to flourish. And so I would like to see this process of influence as a kind of the creation of a kind of intermediate zone in which a literary work is situated in translated form and acts as a source of literary material which is used by others. And what the rationale of this process is that, especially in the case of the 1001 Nights, that it was a very strange work which came suddenly into Western culture, like an intruder, like in German you say a Fremdkörper, an alien text, you might say. So, and because it was inherently interesting, this text, immediately authors started to look at this material, to try to absorb it, to assimilate it, to incorporate it into their own work and into their literary landscape. And this is actually what happened, I think, and this indicates that the interest in the 1001 Nights was not merely ideological or political. It was not only about an image of the other, of the Arabic other. It was also a genuine aesthetic interest in this kind of text and in the material which was involved and which required some kind of interpretation, some kind of interpretive process to be able to situate it in a new literary field. And so this is the process that I would like to propose starting in the 18th century, which draws attention especially to the aesthetic and literary and textual aspect of the whole process of transmission. And this is, I think, this is why I call this whole process incorporation and influence, and not so much appropriation or distortion or whatever, because the dynamics of the whole process of transmission requires this kind of change, this kind of adaptation, etc. And the point is for the 1001 Nights that, of course, the material itself lends itself very well for this kind of incorporation, because it has no author, it is very diverse. It's more or less a diffuse kind of text. So people could use it as a kind of toolkit to do whatever they liked with it, and to use the material in a way that was useful for their own literary views and their own textual experiments. And so, if you talk about influence, this is the way I would envisage the influence, and because of this process, because the 1001 Nights is so suitable, so adequate for this kind of mechanisms, and this is one of the explanations for its enormous triumphal trajectory through world literature, because in every period, all different kinds of authors with totally different backgrounds and different views, they could use the material in some way or another. They could adapt it to their own literary views, to their own literary traditions, their own literary fields. And so I think this is one of the secrets of the fame, that's the iconic status that the 1001 Nights achieved at a certain point.
Thank you so much for that. So we'll stop our discussion and turn to the questions, and I do want to encourage the audience to please write in questions in the Q&A section if you have them for our speakers. But thank you so much, Richard, because that's really, I appreciated many things about your book, but this was one of the major big things, is how you thought about influence in that way, away from the political and more towards the aesthetic and the literary, and what the Nights made possible for the imagination of so many writers. So one of the things you're doing in your book is actually using the Nights to rewrite literary history from a very different perspective. And I really enjoyed that, the way that you explore modernism and postmodernism and their preoccupation with textuality through their relationship to the Nights, rather than to historical changes, as is the dominant argument in literary history. Something changes and people's approach to writing changes as a result. So I like that you're actually putting in that conversation as another version as to why these writers became so preoccupied with the world of the text and saving the world of the text from just being a reflection of that which is around it. Philip, I don't know if you wanted to add something to this idea of influence that we're talking about?
Well, it's something very short, which is obviously, well, 1704 was obviously the sort of turning point year. in a Orientalist vein, of course, because that's the year when Galland, Frenchman, translated the first set of, and then eventually the whole set of Arabian Nights stories into French, and had an immediate influence. Within 2 years, they were translated into English, actually anonymously, oddly enough. And I think in terms of bad influence, one might say, aver that the bad influence happened immediately, and then it just got slightly less bad as the years went by, with the politics and literature being the way they are, but in some kind of linear fashion. I don't think that's true at all. You have to think about a very complex map. I mean, for example, in Japan, the Japanese were isolated for a long time. It's well known. Literary terms in the 18th century, 19th century, they learned about what they learned about the Arab world was through the Arabian Nights, but not through the Arabian Nights, Arabic Arabian Nights, but from the English Arabian Nights, pantomime and that sort of stuff. And so there was this sort of dysfunction, if you like, in what they were really understanding, when they were fascinated by and influenced by the Arabian Nights, and made their own stories influenced by them. And there's a photo here, I don't know if you can, in this book that I edited with Marina Warner. Can you see from a 19th century adaptation of the story Arabian Nights esque? What you have there, it's supposed to take place in Japan. On one side, you've got clearly a Japanese woman, saying that clearly from the way she's dressed and stylization. On the other side of the room, it looks like a drawing room in the Victorian, on Baker Street, in Kirk 1850. What on earth's going on? It's because they thought, oh well, it's that's the sort of, we got English, and we got what we want. So they just. It's quite, so I mean that's obviously dysfunctional representation, but part of the history, and you have to take it on board. But what I wanted to say quickly, the bit I wanted to say quickly is the following: so the influence might have been bad in some respects immediately, but is it also immediately very good? I mean, because there's another essay by Robert Irwin I keep referring to about the influence the Knights had, say, on the development of the novel in England in the 19th century, 18th century. Henry Fielding is very influenced by them in a positive way, not because of the magical surrealism and fantasticality and the fantastical nature of the stories, because of the realism that's in them. Actually, the Hunchback, tale of the Hunchback in the Hunchback cycle is what Fielding was very influenced by in his book Tom Jones, and that might have been just one example of the ways that the English novel changed from being slightly obsessed with the phantasmagorical and more a kind of mimetic. So I'll stop there. Well, by the way, there's Marina Warner's book, which tells us at the same time the influence, not because of the realism it brought, but it also it freed in the Enlightenment period it freed the people in the Enlightenment from the constraints of not believing in the magical and the whimsical and fantastic. They're two separate things, I've said, but both had very powerful influence in the West. Positive.
Thank you for that, because that's something that seems counterintuitive, that one of the major influences of the Knights was in its realism. And not the fantasy aspect of it. So we'll come back to that. I'm going to start fielding a few of the questions that are in the Q&A. One of the attendees asked about how we can challenge the Orientalist readings and approach 2001 Nights, but I think, Richard, you addressed that earlier quite eloquently on the aesthetic and the literary appropriation, as opposed to just the more politically charged understanding.
Maybe I can stress that the political aspect is not unimportant. Of course, it's there. The ideological component is present in the influence of the 1001 Nights as well. The only thing I'm saying is that it should not be the only way to look at this whole process. There are other aspects as well. And well, an important element in this whole discussion is the question of authenticity. What is actually whose property is a text? Which is and this is something which is very difficult to uphold in the case of the 1001 Nights, because its history is still quite ambivalent, and we don't know everything about how the text actually developed even in Arabic. So we have to accept a certain element of hybridity in the whole process of transmission of the 1001 Nights, which includes ideological aspects and textual and literary aspects.
Absolutely. I mean, another speaker had a similar question, and I want to pronounce the name as Feta, hopefully I'm saying it right, but also about how Galland was able to, or had to at least, condense a lot of characteristics of many different people into certain aspects in his translations or renditions of the Nights, and bringing up this idea of the demeaning stereotype that is born through the night. So again, this feeds into this other thing that you're talking about, Richard, which is how do we, yes, we understand that this happened, we acknowledge that it's there, but also what else was happening to account for this, the longevity of the influence and the extent of the influence of the Nights. One question, and this goes back to the realism, Philip, that you were talking about, wonders whether the 1001 Nights is actually a reflection of a more relaxed environment of the Abbasid Empire towards pleasure or towards desire or towards, and this is, you know, some of the arguments about the realism of the Nights have to do with that, reading them in the context in which some of them, at least we know, were collected. Would you have anything to say to that, Philip?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difficulty of chronology there in considering the history of the Nights. Is anything with the libidinous understrain or strain more relaxed than what I'm referring to? I'm not sure. But I don't think it has anything to do with the Abbasids, actually. I think it's most of these stories came from Mamluk times, even those that mention Harun al-Rashid and Jafar. I think Abu Shamat, Aladdin Abu Shamat is clearly a Mamluk story, but it has it's set in Baghdad, where there's a Harun al-Rashid and a Jafar and Barmaki, and presumably they're the same ones that we know from history. So it's this sort of, they don't tell history, the Arabian Nights, so it's hard to detail, therefore, a social history or get a social history from them. But certainly people in the West who liked things they were reading would be influenced by them. Maybe they felt, yeah, this is interesting stuff. I feel relaxed when I read this. I'm not sure.
Oh, we have a couple of questions. I'm going to combine Sonia, Khatri's, and Paulo's questions about how do we make the Nights interesting for the newer generation? So that's Sonia's question. And then Paulo, extending on that, the question is, what would translators and scholars like to see in future translations of the 1001 Nights in English? Perhaps what are the ways stylistically or otherwise that we can think about making the nights resonant and remain powerful and remain influential in the lives of newer generations, especially in English translation?
Shall I try to respond?
Yeah.
Well, I've heard there is someone working on a new English translation, and I'm really curious about the choices she will make. Because we were discussing this some time ago, and she said, well, what do you do with, for instance, the all kinds of stereotypes that are in the text? Of course, it's an ancient text, and it contains a lot of, well, you might say stereotypal or flat characters, which contain some kind of racial essence or about religion, religious essence, and with all the stereotypal attributes connected to them. And well, it's when I translated 1001 Nights, this was not so much an issue, but I think at the moment it is, and you have to decide how you treat, for instance, the stereotypical representations of black characters, which usually have a very negative connotation and a negative role, or Christians for that matter, that are almost always drunk or on the way to the tavern. So this is difficult, and on the one hand, you can adapt the text to a certain extent in style and tone, etc., to make it appreciable for a modern audience. But on the other hand, it's difficult to solve this kind of problem, I think. So, well, I'm really curious if this, of course, the whole tradition of translation has this kind of how do you say, accommodation to the mentalities of the time and the conventions of the time. So you can trace actually within the tradition of the different translations the context in which these translations were made, because they're really different. Galant is a totally different translation from the translation by Burton or others. And so you can see in Galant the European Enlightenment. You can in Burton see the Victorian period in its different aspects. Edward Lane also has a different represents a different side of the Victorian mentality. The German translations also have a very different context, and you can read these contexts in the translations themselves. And so there's a continuity on the one hand, but also the translations are being accommodated and being transformed in the development of this tradition. And this will go on. And the translator will have to make choices. And I'm glad actually that I'm not responsible for making a new translation, because some of these decisions will be quite difficult. So,
agreed. Philip?
I stuck up my hand there just at I wanted to make a point related to, because Richard was going through it almost chronologically, the translators from Galant through Lane, Burton, etc. And I thought I'd put my hand up and identify the culprit, if there's a culprit in all of this. And it's Mardrus, who claimed that he was producing a literal translation of every word in the Arabian Nights, more or less. But in fact, what he did produce was a text where only about 66% of the works translated were from the Arabian Nights. The rest were, he just made them up, brought them from whatever sources he had. So he actually was rather dishonest with his audience. But the thing about Madras as well, I don't think one would get away with that now. He got away with it big time. I mean, he was a friend of André Gide, of T. Lawrence. The other thing is he did was with Madras, because Madras was so popular, it actually created this Orientalism at the end of the 19th century, the turn of that century, you know, sort of when the ballets and the symphonies, and there was a kind of Orientalism, you know, and all these baggy pants that started coming out with Madras. You know, it all started there. I mean, a lot of the aesthetic started with Madras. I think if we're trying to identify phases in Orientalist takes, I think Madras wasn't a particularly healthy. Although I like Madras actually, and he made some good choices. I just wanted to make that point.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's a very important example because actually Madras took material from everywhere, and he just made a kind of collection with no original. And it was just material from all kinds of sources, and he reworked the material also to make it more how do you say, pleasing for the European taste at the period in which he succeeded. And he was, of course, Oriental in the sense that he grew up in Egypt, so he was considered to be an Oriental, and the critics actually praised his translation as more authentic than the original. Mm-hmm. More original actually than the original, which is and because he did not faithfully translate the text, but he reworked it, being an Oriental, so it became more authentic than the original material. So it is very interesting to see how these mechanisms work, and how strange, how do you say, these strange effects that you create, and what is actually authenticity. And this is, I think, a very important element in the whole discussion of the transmission of text, because the idea of authenticity more or less disappears. It should always be substituted by hybridity or something like that, because there is no way of transmitting anything while retaining its authenticity. And I think, this is of course a matter of discussion, a matter of debate, because it's always, especially if you translate, to what extent do you have to stick to an original, and what is your space to add or to change or to adapt. And this question has been relevant for the 1001 Nights because it has no author. It doesn't have real standard texts to which you can refer. So a lot of translators just edit some material, mm-hmm. Because they liked it or because they wanted to present something new. And it was always presented as more authentic than the previous translation. This is one of the structural features of this whole tradition. The old translators say, well, now we have the real thing, the real 1001 Nights, and all the previous translations are rubbish, or they are distortions, falsifications, etc. So they added a new falsification, which was more authentic.
Yeah.
So this is a very complex and interesting process of how this transmission should be conceptualized.
Can I just say something, Maya? Mm-hmm. Just to add to this, when Richard said that what he just said, that someone else is going to translate the whole of the Arabian Nights, sort of, well, not another. I mean, because the problem is, it's not that I object to someone doing a good translation. The problem is it's the bibliography is so huge and it becomes messy. So I when I teach maybe nights occasionally, I say, well, look, you might go to any bookshop in the world, although they don't really exist anymore, bookshops. They used to exist in the old days, bookstores. You go into a bookstore and you find something. You might find a version of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, the anonymous early 18th century translation. Or you might find Jonathan Scott. You'd be lucky if you did. Or you might find a couple of volumes of Lane. If you've got the third supplementary one, that'd be great. Or Burton, then you'd have to order a limousine to go home. Or you could find a couple of volumes of Madras. You might find the French, or you could find the English translation from Madras by Powys Mathers. And it goes on. And so what you might find is one called the Arabian Nights, another called the 1001 Nights. And if you put it all together, it's a mess. So I say, well, what I'm going to do is clear up the mess for you. so that when you've got a book in your hands that you picked off the shelf in some bookstore anywhere left to right, you'll know what it is. Oh, this is the second volume of Lane. Great, I know when this was done. And I know what his penchant was for picking out or being very prudish. So there's no libidinous stuff here. Yes, I can see. He's taking out the nights. Okay, there's a footnote. Are there other footnotes the professor was talking about? Great. There you got Lane. Then you get Burton, and then you think, I'm not taking these home. I'm not taking these home to mum and dad. I'm going to put them in the attic and take them out when the world's a different place. But anyway, it's just a mess. It's a mess. So who's gonna? We just need some kind of some order. Yes, we need someone to come out. Maybe it has to be Richard. An essay that everyone should read that tells you. What these
the whole idea is that it's not possible to clear up this mess. So this is.
But it is a mess.
Yes, it is a mess, certainly. But literature is a mess. It's not possible to really how do you say drive the storytelling back into its cage. The whole idea of the 1001 Nights is that once you start telling stories, there's no end, and it will go anyway. It will go in all directions, and it will always create new stories, and there will always be variations and diversity. It will cross all imaginable boundaries. So it will go on and go on and go on, and it will change, it will transform, and you can never really put your hand on it, and you can never confine it into a specific genre or a specific category or a specific space or a specific time. And so this is one of the interesting things of the 1001 Nights, is it exemplifies the mess that storytelling actually is. And so this is what authors also find fascinating, I think, about it, and why authors, even in modern time, even in recent years, they keep drawing on the 1001 Nights and referring to the 1001 Nights because of this dynamism that you cannot really catch the spirit, the essence of storytelling. It will take you with it. It will abduct you, and you cannot escape it. You cannot resist it. And so this is the whole idea. And you will be drawn in a very messy landscape, and you will never know exactly where you are. But this is what it is about. So you're a clear example of that Shahrazad actually succeeded in creating this mess for you and making you feel helpless, because this was the whole idea, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is so. One of the questions from Magda is to you, Richard, about what are the main aesthetic elements that have traveled through the 1001 Nights to the Western tradition. I would say perhaps that the confusion aestheticized is perhaps one of them. Would you consider that to be one of the highlights? Another question from Al has to do with the story within the story and its influence on film and dream structure in film. So maybe a way to think about these two things together is the structure of the frame tale as a particular element, aesthetic element, if we want, of the night. So there might be confusion in how we put them together and how we identify, but the frame tale, that is definitely a repeated structure, you would say, right? That has identifiable legacies for Western literature.
Yeah, well, I think there are many factors that have contributed to the popularity of the 1001 Nights, for authors, I mean, especially. One of them is the concept of storytelling, the concept of the work as a framed tale. And in framing story, it is explained why the stories are told, what the function of the telling of stories actually is. It is to fight against violence, to represent a vision of the world through the imagination, which counters kind of how do you say, closed vision of rigid vision of a life from a specific perspective, which includes violence. And so you have this opposition between violence and the imagination. This is very important as a source for storytelling and as a reason why stories should be told, because actually stories are what our lives are made of. This is actually the message of the 1001 Nights. As long as you keep on telling stories, you will stay alive. If you stop telling the stories, you will not survive, you will die. And so this is a very important conceptual element of the collection, which epitomizes the essence of storytelling. And of course, a lot of authors recognize this. And some are very explicit. They say, well, you are my audience, and I have to write interesting things for you, to keep you fascinated. Otherwise, I will stop being a writer, and I will not earn my money anymore. I will, etc. So they take it very literally as their task. And so they take the example of Sheikh as an image of their own activity. So this is clearly something that touches upon the self-image and the essence of what writers think about their work. Mm-hmm. So this is one important aspect, and you can return to this always, whether you're in 21st century, in the 18th or the 19th century, you can always go back to this basic element, this basic concept of what narration, writing, storytelling is about. So this is timeless, you might say. But I also think that the whole structure of framing, to have a framing tale and inserted tales, is also a very ingenious device to structure storytelling. Mm-hmm. On one hand, it seems like a kind of device to show that a story is never happening on its own. There are always other stories connected to it. There are other stories simultaneously happening. And this cannot be represented in the way we do in modern novels, for instance, in which you can switch between times or between perspectives. And so the inserted tale is more or less to show that every story has its branches, has its different stories which are connected or which are parallel somehow. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect is that inserted stories indicate that the whole idea of postponement, of going to stepping to new stories, to continue storytelling. So this whole structure of interruption and continuation is vital for the idea of storytelling. Because immediately, if a story stops, and there are many authors who make use of this feeling, that is, if a story stops, and then there's a void, and you suddenly are confronted with some kind of helplessness. You have to know how it continues, because it becomes part of your life. And if you want to live on, you have to know how this story continues. And so this is very important, this structure is very important for the act of storytelling, for the secret, the magic of storytelling. There's, for instance, a novel by Calvino, Italo Calvino, which plays on this. He says more or less that life is a text. So this is the same thing. What we think we are living, but actually we are texts. So if a text is interrupted, there's nothing left. So there's a void. So we are all struggling to continue the story in some way or another. If someone else stops, then we have to continue, or someone else has to continue. And we're always looking for this continuation, and we always have the fear that the storytelling will suddenly stop. Mm-hmm. So this is, I think, for authors, a very inspiring and important element, which is represented by the framing structure of the Nights.
Yes, Philip.
Can we? I don't want to interrupt, but I'm doing it. Do you want to talk about some missing stuff? I'm making it very basic the way I'm asking the question. There's some, because there was a question where you were going to ask us about some. Are there any stories where there's stuff missing, materials missing? How would you replace it? That was a question. Because Richard was saying, a story may suddenly stop. Obviously, if it stops, it needs to be continued. Mm. So I just wondered if we could talk about the 10 missing pages of Vail's German translation of the Arabian Nights in the story called The South by Borges. If not, we can go on with the other questions.
We could.
Yeah,
it's up.
Time. Because you decide.
We do have many questions. We probably won't be able to get to many of them, but let's try to get to yeah, and then we'll see because one question from Lina has to do with Shahrazad herself, who I opened by talking about as, for me, the pivotal identifier of the Nights. And then the question has to do with how you two think that the character of Shahrazad has influenced other literary characters. I know, Richard, in your book, you struggle with this a little bit when you think about feminisms and localized feminism. What do we do? And this is, again, goes back to the question of translation, but also the question of violence. What do we do with things in the text that we're not comfortable with right now or in these days? So maybe I can have the two of you think a little bit with me about gender. This is a gendered storyteller at the end of the day. She is telling stories to save her life, which wouldn't have been the situation had she been a man, for example. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that.
Well, I think it's a very important question. Obviously, it's the important question. Scheherazade is the icon. One of the icons for women in the world, writ large. I don't know when she became that icon, but she certainly is now. But she's always been that icon. I don't know. But there's a problem. I always... When I introduce that idea, I say you're going to have to grow with the idea and decide what it means for you, you know. There's a problem with the idea, the kind of paradox involved, which is the fact that we're pretty sure, although we don't know who wrote the night, we're pretty sure that the redactors were men. I don't know why, but they probably were. And yet they created this icon of womanhood and storytelling and creativity, giving birth to stories as a woman. So, I mean, I don't know how you deal with that paradox, if that's what it is. It's kind of disjunction, I don't know what it is. Or is it just that there's hope for men? And the fact that the creators of the Arabian Nights actually made the star of the show, the great woman, who lasts down through the ages. So I find it difficult to say much more than that. But, so, Richard, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, well, I think the figure of Sheikh is, of course, very, very interesting, and I think the gender aspect is really very important in this. I have a theory that the 1001 Nights might actually be a parody on a genre which existed in Arabic literature, but also in European literature, which is typically very misogynistic, which is about a king being seduced by a concubine, for instance, listening to her advice, doing what she says, and thereby destroying the empire. And because he has allowed the sensuality, the irrationality of women to interfere with the rationality of the administration of his empire. And so this is a topos, that women are a threat to the survival of kingship, of empires, of etc. And these roles have been inverted in the 1001 Nights, because here, actually, on one hand, it looks like the spouse of the king is destroying the empire by deceiving him and by her adultery. But then, on the other hand, it is Sheikh as a woman who saves the empire and who returns a kind of sensitivity to the king, which actually takes him out of this cycle of killing women and actually, heading for the destruction of his empire. So I think this is kind of inversion of the stereotypical roles which existed in misogynistic literature in medieval Arabic period. But on the other hand, as Philip says, it is Sheikh has a kind of heroic role, but on the other hand, it is, I think, quite clear that we should not immediately attribute feminist, connotations to this. In a way, we should perhaps, but on the other hand, it is clear that the collection, even the frame story, were written by men, and they are clearly appealing to a male imagination as well. Although there are a lot of strong women, but some feminist students of the 1001 Nights have pointed at even the strong-willed women in many stories of the 1001 Nights, they appeal to a certain kind of a male image of women as being strong and dominant, etc. So, as Philip said, this is quite ambivalent, and it can be debated. There are a lot of clearly anti-feminist elements in the 1001 Nights, and there are also very strong women and weak men. But still, it is a matter of interpretation to what extent you would really connect this with modern feminist ideas. So it's not so easy, but on the other hand, you can see that it is quite easy if you look away from all these complexities. That Sheikh is a very nice, iconic figure to attach all kinds of feminist ideas and ideas of liberation. And this has happened in literature quite a lot. And so for some, Sheikh is really a feminist icon. While for others, well, it's still ambivalent. It's not easy to judge exactly what, as a narrative character in the 1001 Nights, what she really represents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Depends on which place you're reading from, I think. It's always a difficult question to answer. So I think maybe one last question, because that's something I'm also interested in. Kevin asks about the Arab or Middle Eastern reception of the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. So we talked a lot about the Western reception. And he says that in schools, which is true, having gone to school in the Arab world, you are introduced to elite literature. So poetry of Mutanabbi, when you're going to school, you're not really taught the 1001 Nights. And then, so the question that Kevin has is, why is it not so valorized? But I would also link it to, and maybe we can talk about this in conclusion, Richard, when you talk about the Arab adaptations of the 1001 Nights with Tawfiq al-Hakim and Mahfouz, so the legacy in the Arab world. So it's a twofold question. One, the early reception and how it was rejected as non-elite literature. And then the second part is that when it was taken up, how was it taken up in modern Arabic literature? Because it seems to be very politically driven in its afterlives in the Arab world. So maybe I can have the two of you comment on that in conclusion. Philip, you're muted again.
Yeah. It's a good question, yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, we were taught, I was taught at university as an undergraduate that Arab culture, literatures, Arabic cultured society didn't really like the Nights. It was written in a bad, low register of Arabic, considered poorer, storytelling. Whatever. I mean, it was just, you get the, and we didn't read them at undergraduate level. But we were told that Al-Hakim and Dar Hussein and then eventually Naguib Mahfouz started, changing the order of things, I think. But I think, and now I think there is, we're in a different situation, And I know I asked Ashwini myself when I was interviewing him about Babashan. He said, yes, everyone says that you were inspired by the Arabian Nights, in part to write Bab al-Shams. And is that true? Do you think that's true? He said, yeah, absolutely. It's also true of the Arab, Ali. So, I think things have changed. What happened before, there was some importance given to the Nights, but it's more to do with the textual history, the Arab textual history, and the production of printed editions. Because the most important early printed edition was not Calcutta 1, which is 100 stories, I think, but there's no editing going on there. It was just produced as manuals to teach from. But Bulaq, the Bulaq edition of 1835-ish was very important, I think, and we still use it. And it showed that the Arabs were very much involved in the process of sort of gathering the Nights and allowing them to grow further after 1704 and what Galan did to them in other languages. They were still there producing manuscripts, and eventually they produced one of the most important early editions, which is still, as I say, important. In fact, Another great fan of the Arabian Nights was Jamal Ghitani, and he gave me a copy. He had that. He had the Bulak reprinted. Lovely book. I think he had trouble with that actually, but I think maybe the importance is more on the Arab, the making available to Arabophone readers a text to read. So I think it's in part the answer to the question, which is a big question. So yeah. I'll just stop there.
Richard, do you have any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, as far as we know, the opinions about the 1001 Nights have always been ambivalent in the Arabic world, in the Arabic tradition. We have references to the 1001 Nights in old texts, but usually they are considered as frivolous literature, which is not part of the literary canon, which is not part of civilized literature, etc., because it's about jinns and it doesn't have the strict rules for style and use of language, etc., the level of language. But on the other hand, it says nothing about its popularity. It might have been very popular at the same time. Yeah. And in modern times, we have the same ambivalence. There are some people who say, well, this is actually, the whole 1001 Nights is an invention of the West. It's not really representing the Arabic literary tradition or Arabic literary taste. So we should not spend too much attention on this type of literature, because it's a kind of anomaly within the Arabic tradition. But other authors, especially modern Arabic authors, say, well, no, the 1001 Nights is one of the quintessential works of Arabic literature. It's about liberation, it's about storytelling, it's about imagination, about fantasy, etc. So we should emancipate this work and liberate it from these negative connotations and use it as an example for modern authors and a source of inspiration for literary freedom, for freedom of speech, for the liberation of women, etc. So they're very different, sometimes contradictory opinions which you find. But especially in modern literature, I think modern authors are usually of the kind that are very appreciative of the 1001 Nights and consider it very important to take it as a source of inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Philip, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to our audience for the beautiful questions and for staying with us.
And thank you.
Thank you. I wish you all a very good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.